Hello and welcome to WoodPods, the podcast designed to share sporting experience and knowledge to instill passion within the NLCS Dubai community on behalf of Team NLCS. This week we hear from David Clamp, a triathlete who has completed in 150 Ironman triathlons over the last 30 years and completed 6 double Ironman races and 9 triple Ironman races back to back. Dave continued to pursue his endurance limits by completing in Decas, with a Deca being the equivalent of completing 10 Ironman distances. Dave now competes in double Decas, completing 20 triathlons of Ironman distances over 20 days back to back. And as the current double Deca world record holder, Dave is an amazing inspiration of what mental and physical resilience can truly look like.
Welcome to WoodPods. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Nicola, and hello to all the children from North London Collegiate School in Dubai.
So many of our students would have heard of aquathons, duathlons and triathlons, but I imagine only a few of them would have heard of what a Deca is. So can we start with the very obvious question of what is a Deca?
I actually started with the Ironman distance, which is those distances of 2.4 miles swim, 112 mile bike and a marathon run, 26.2 miles. So if you multiply that by 10, the word Deca is the Latin for 10. That's what my races are, 10 times those distances. So instead of a 2.4 mile swim, it's a 24 mile swim. The 112 mile bike becomes 1,120. And the run, instead of a mere 26.2 miles, becomes 262 miles. And
wow.
There are races in between distances. I gradually crept up to it from single Ironmans, doubles and triples, but then did a jump from triple to the Deca.
Wow, how amazing. Who inspired you to get involved with triathlon, and then who inspired you further to become involved with the Decas?
I don't think it was any particular person who gradually inspired me. I think I gradually found that I'd got a peculiar ability, and that ability seemed to be that when I entered races that were longer, I finished higher up the finishing order. When I was in my early 20s, I just did, and that was at the time of the first marathon boom. So started doing marathons then, but just for fun. Gradually branched out into doing fell running. And it's only when triathlon came along, and lots of those triathlons were short ones. They only lasted 1 hour or 2 hours. Only as slightly longer ones started coming along, I just found that I would be more successful in the longer ones. So it just kind of crept up and up that way. There weren't especially that many sporting heroes then. I suppose in Ironman, the two that everybody remembers, well, from my era, were two chaps called Mark Allen and Dave Scott. And there are really good books about those two called The Iron Wars, when they would go to Hawaii. I think Mark Allen won it something like 6 times and Dave Scott a similar amount of times, and they would always be racing head to head, and nobody knew which one of them would win. So yeah. They were the first pioneers of just raising the bar of how fast people realised that they could actually go.
Mm-hmm. And what age did you complete your first Deca?
First Deca would have been in maybe 49, I think, because it was a gradual step up in distances and lifestyle. Sure. And to prepare for a Deca, you do need a particular kind of lifestyle. So I'd got in when I was in my late 30s is when I started first training harder and found myself in the Great Britain elite team for Ironman racing in the 1990s. So I think that was, in 1995, we as a team won the bronze medal in the European Championships. And it was, I got my fastest times at Ironman around about 1997. It was a bit of a golden year for me. I did just under 9 hours for Ironman and followed it 2 months later in the Manchester Marathon with 2 hours 36. So those are 2 times that I've never beaten since.
Wow.
Shortly after that, a friend of mine at Christmas, we saw an advert for a double Ironman. So that was my first venture into longer races. It was a race that was in Holland. And he kind of said, oh, how about entering that? And it was just 5 months off. So I did a reasonable amount of training for it.
Yeah.
And arrived in Holland. And I remember at the time that the other competitors who were quite experienced were kind of saying, who's this stupid English guy going off in the front, in the lead on his own? He'll soon slow down. But they never caught me. And I won that race by over an hour. And apparently the guy who was the best in the world at the time came second. And it was suddenly at that age, I'd found something that I could excel at. So that has been the encouragement for me then to keep going and trying the longer races.
It certainly sounds like you found your niche. So what age were you when you became the ultra triathlon world record holder?
Well, that was the race in 2016. So I'll have been 56, 57 then. So that was 20 Ironman races in 20 days. That was the one that I broke the world record for.
That's phenomenal.
So that was right. There are 2 versions of the Deca. That's what is the thing to understand about them. There's one called the continuous Deca, where you do all the swimming at once. So you swim 24 miles. Then when you finish your 24 miles, you cycle the 1,120, and then you run the 262 miles. And it's up to you when you stop and start, because the world record's around about 8 days. So obviously you've got to build in sleep into that. You can't just keep going and going. Whereas the race that I won the world record in was doing a single Ironman each day, but for 20 continuous days. So I would get up and do a 2.4 mile swim, then the 112 mile bike, and then a 26.2 mile run. So I was doing it round about 11 to 12 hours most days, and then having 12 hours to go back to the hotel, have a good meal, hot bath, relax, nice 7 or 8 hours sleep, and back to do the same again the next day.
Do you consider that you've got a natural ability for this sport, or has it come through the endurance and methods of training that you've used?
I find it quite interesting, and I think especially for the children, a lot of them might well relate to what I'm about to say, that I don't feel that degree of natural ability is really there. And I can remember when I first went to a boys only grammar school aged 11, and we would typically have a games lesson where the ones who were best at football would be there'd be 4 of them, and they'd go to the front, and they would take it in turns to pick people for their teams who they wanted, you know. So it was gradually the weaker and weaker players would be left standing against the wall, nobody wanting them. And I can tell you that I was always the last one that nobody wanted on their team. So I would say at age 11, that natural ability wasn't there. And then if you weren't good at football, it's kind of, oh, you can go and do cross country then. And so aged 11, I would do the school cross country races, but say if there were 70 people in them, I would finish 65th or something like that, somewhere really very near the back. So I really feel that the natural ability wasn't there for me. And so I think my PE teacher from school would never, ever even remember my name, which is quite surprising really now when you think that all these years on, I'm probably the highest achieving sports person that school's ever had. And
yeah, absolutely. What a fantastic story. So obviously you're involved in swimming, cycling and running. Have you got a particular discipline that's strongest amongst those?
I'm quite unusual really in that I don't think I have, that I'm quite even at all 3. It's varied at different times. When I was on the Great Britain team for single Ironman races, I would say that the other competitors would have said that my running was the key thing, that was what they kind of feared if they were racing me, that they needed a big lead before the run section if they were going to beat me. Because when I was at the peak at those races, I think when I did that sub 9 hour race, having just cycled the 112 miles in 4 hours 52, I think it was, that I was able to get off the bike and run the marathon in 2 hours 58. So that was definitely my strength at the time. But I found since then that it's really varied over the years, depending on which one I've put the most work in. And in the Deca, I always feel really comfortable cycling now. It just seems to be that speed. I've never quite had the speed to be absolutely explosive. Say if a 25-mile time trial on the bike, my times are not remarkable at all. They're above average, but they're not somebody who would be winning races. But I seem to be able to keep almost the time that I can do for 25 miles. I can keep it going for 100 or 200 miles, whereas most people would slow right down as the distance got longer.
Yeah. So obviously the Deca competitions are days upon days. So how many hours a week do you have to train?
When I find that I gradually build it throughout the year. I find it almost impossible to sustain the maximum levels constantly throughout the 12 months. So I have a general feeling, because usually the races are in August onwards during the year. So in England, we get the worst of the weather around December, January. So they tend to be the lowest volume of training for me, especially cycling, because I'm not really going to go out cycling if the temperature's below 3 degrees or so, when I think, there's a fair chance of ice and it's going to be dangerous. But once I get to March, April, May, I'm building up to generally training somewhere between 20 and 30 hours a week, and some weeks even quite a lot over that.
And it's clear that when you spend a large amount of time training, you'll need to do other things which are equally as important, sleeping and recovering. So how do you manage that self-discipline, and how does it play out within your training?
I feel it's important that my training is actually enjoyable. So it's almost a bit like diets in a way, isn't it? That most diets end in failure because people are sort of punishing themselves in the end, not really enjoying the food that they're eating and eating less. So it might be successful for a short while, but the only way it's going to be enjoyable is if you actually change things around to enjoying the way that you're eating to lose the weight. So I think with the training, the key thing is to actually enjoy it on a day-by-day basis. And I would say I do actually enjoy each moment when I'm training. Sometimes when you're out, say, for a 5 or 6 hour training ride and the weather isn't that great, the motivation can be harder. But then I try and find little tricks to make myself do the longer ride, like rather than staying closer to home. Say if I'm going to do a 100-mile bike ride, I make sure that I go, by the time I get to the turnaround point, I've still got another 50 miles to do, because I know if I was doing it in a smaller circuit, my little brain would find a good excuse not to do the 100 miles and to cut it down to 60 or 70 or something. And then you have a little argument with yourself when you hate yourself for having done that. But then when you get home, you're so happy that you've done it. So it's all like constant mind games and a battle very often.
And apart from training, what are the essential ingredients to maintain such a high level of training and success within a sport?
Well, it's definitely getting enough rest. That's becoming one of the key concepts that people haven't recognised as much in the past. The body's best recovery method is sleep. So it's pretty much 95% of us would say you're needing 7 or 8 hours of good quality sleep if you're wanting to get the optimum performance out of yourself. Following on from that is the diet. So very important that you put in the right fuel into your body to sustain the training.
It's clear that you obviously spend a lot of time training. Let's talk about your training in the fact that, you know, you must have a favourite place that you train. Is that in the UK? Is that abroad? And do you do, like other athletes, altitude training?
I've not done altitude training as such. I live in a very nice area in Cheshire where it's really great for going out cycling. The only downside I would say from it was that I used to live in Bolton, which is a very hilly area of the UK, and that used to naturally build up a lot of greater cycling strength. And if you're not careful in Cheshire, you can lapse into this moderate kind of effort training. So in these last few weeks when we've been tied down to training at home and staying in the house, I've realised that by doing all my cycling indoors, that it is actually fatiguing me a lot more, which has made me think along those lines that a fair amount of my cycling previously was probably in a lot more of a comfort zone. But to get back to the questions of where I like training, I have some friends who I visit and I work with them as well. They're in Spain, down near Calpe. I go and stay with them maybe once, twice a year and spend the whole week cycling. They run a cycle retreats business where people go and stay with them, and they take them out cycling every day around all the local areas. So I help guiding.
In terms of your competitions, where do these take place?
It's global, really. The one where I broke that world record was in Switzerland. So 3 times I think I've been and raced at that venue. Then the other most popular venue for them has been in Mexico. So the first one that I did was in Monterrey, and then I've been back 3 times to another city in Mexico called Leon. And then 2 years ago, I went to New Orleans, and that's where I'm hopefully going back again this year.
Fantastic. And what event is that for?
This year, there are 2 events. There's a continuous World Championships in Switzerland, so that's starting in the middle of August. So the latest date we've got is that April the 30th, they're going to decide one way or another whether that will take place or not. No way of knowing, but I feel we've got more chance currently for the one in New Orleans, which is in November. There are various formats of racing that are taking place in that one, but the one that I would be entering is 30 Ironmans in 30 days.
And have you done that before?
No. I did actually enter it. I think it was in 2011, and I was at the fittest I'd ever been. It was going to be in Italy. I'd got everything ready. I think 8 different people were coming out to help me at different times. We'd booked hotels. Everything was organised. And on the final training ride that I did the week before it, and then the last bit of the final training ride, I had a bike accident. I got knocked off and I broke my collarbone. And that was it. So in a way, this will be quite interesting because it'll be 8 or 9 years on from then. It's like unfinished business.
You've been really fortunate to travel the world with your competitions. What's been your favourite event up until now?
I'd say the one that sticks in my mind was the race in Switzerland, the 20 Ironmans in 20 days.
Okay, so you've recently had a hip injury. How's the rehab going, and how are you managing to keep training up alongside this?
Yeah, it's been quite a shocking event, really. It's been quite a lengthy and difficult rehab experience. For about 2 months, I could do nothing. I was on crutches. But then I found the best rehab activity was my swimming, and did lots and lots of swimming with a pull buoy between my legs. So it was arms only. So I swam so much that I got to the stage where my swimming was faster than it had been before the accident. And then I got back into cycling. One of the toughest aspects of cycling was almost the fact that I've had such a dramatic accident. So there's the PTSD aspect of it, and feeling quite anxious cycling back out onto the roads again. So that's been quite a battle with the cycle training. But I've gradually built up the volume, and I would say my cycling is pretty much back to about 95% of where I was. But the biggest difficulty with returning to training is definitely the running with those screws in the hip. It's 9-10 months on now. I would say I've managed to get my 10k running time down to about 51 minutes, but before the accident it was 34. But I've been working with a really good physiotherapist and had orthotics fitted as well. So at first I started running too much, and because I was running in this wonky style, the knock-on effect of that was that I ended up with a bulging disc as well. So I had my running style analysed, and the physiotherapist realised that I needed orthotics as well. So, but definitely the running is the most challenging, but we've seen recent good progress, and it almost seems like it could be almost a semi-miraculous comeback to be back racing again this year.
Well, we wish you all the best for that. Now, you've recently been down to Loughborough University, which is one of the top universities in the world for sports science. How exciting was that? What tests did they run on you? What did they find?
Well, it was all kinds of tests that they did. I've been 3 times, I think, in the last 10 years. They were curious to find. They were convinced that they were going to do various tests and find something about my body that gave me an unequal advantage or something, or just to find something that they could find that explained why I was as good as I was at ultra long distance events. Before I went, I kept telling them that I don't think you're going to find anything. I just feel it's so much in the head, and it's just practice. But they did lots of tests, VO2 max. Most of the tests I finished, well above average, but not exceptional. And there were even some tests like the power test on the bike, and you would think with all the cycling that I do, I would have had one of the best scores, because they're always testing people down there. But when I did the test, they said the bad news was that I had a really poor score on it. The good news was that I scored the same as Chris Boardman. So sometimes it's almost one of these inexplicable things. He was one of the world's top cyclists, and he didn't score what would be considered a really top-end score for power on the bike.
And just changing topics to sports nutrition. So what's your standard pre-race meal?
Well, it's very different, really. It depends on the level of racing that I'm doing, whether it's a short, fast race or a Deca. For a Deca, during the Deca race, you're pretty much carrying on with normal life. So to have a pre-race meal, you just need to be fully loaded up before you start. So typically the race in Switzerland starts at 6 p.m. So with it starting at that time, there's usually a banquet at midday, which is full of pasta loaded with carbohydrates, ready for doing a 24-mile swim at 6 o'clock in the evening, starting then. But in the races that start at 6 o'clock in the morning, you're not wanting, your body just isn't ready to eat such an immense meal so soon before it. That's just not its normal pattern. But the thing we're doing at Deca is that we're eating throughout the race. So typically the race in Switzerland, they provide us with 3 main meals during the day. And so, but it'll be, on the bike, I'll stop somewhere between every 3 or 4 hours. I'll stop for about 10 minutes and eat like a full 3-course meal.
Okay, so there is a great term that food is morale. So when you are on those long races, what type of food do you like to graze to keep your energy and your spirits up?
Well, I would say I've gradually changed. I've completely moved away from sports nutrition, gels and the like. They certainly have their place in shorter races for giving you a sudden burst of energy. But in the Deca race, you just need the continual release of energy. So I mainly do have especially during the bike section, it will be those, real good 3-course meals, say every 3 or 4 hours. So just a main course, dessert, maybe something sweet at the end, and I'll have drink coffee and tea and cold drinks at the same time.
How does that work? Do you pull up and someone cooks you a meal? You knock on someone's door, or is it all prepared in a tent?
No, the races are always on a very small lap format, which some people hate the thought of that, but I actually prefer it. So in Switzerland, each lap is 6 miles. So we've gone typically about 17 or 18 minutes on each lap. So it works quite well, and all the support crews all have a camping area where they're all sitting out together. So it's quite a nice little athletes village that develops. Everybody's got tents, and so as you're coming round every 20 minutes, it's like you can just have a quick word with the people who are supporting you, saying, I'll stop for a meal after 1 lap or after 2 laps. So it gives people a chance to go and prepare it for you. So it's almost like a pit stop in a Grand Prix, that as you come round on the next lap, it's just jumping off the bike. Well, it's a really unusual thing as to what you need to keep your body going. So a typical person would say around about 2,000 calories in a day to keep you going. When you're doing the Deca, because I'll be on the go for maybe 22 hours a day, it can be anything up to around about 10,000 calories a day that you're putting in your body. Think of that 5 times more than normal. It has, it's quite an interesting impact that it has on your body.
So if you're exercising for 22 out of 24 hours when you're doing a Deca, the listeners are going to want to know, when and where are you sleeping?
Yeah, well, it's just in the tents. It's the theory used to be people used to stop at midnight and then take a full night's sleep in the early Decas and then start again. Whereas those of us who started pushing and pushing and pushing for faster times have realised that we can gradually push back the barriers of sleep that's needed. The bike section will typically take me about 4 days. And I know that for 3 days, I can get away with having somewhere around about 1.5 to 2 hours sleep a night. And that is just pulling into the tent at the edge of the road, just lying down on a camp bed there and saying to the support crew, or maybe eating the food first, but then saying, has anybody got anything to say to me? Because I'm going to sleep now. 3, 2, 1, gone. And you can actually go to sleep like that. It's really weird. But I find that if you go into a 4th night of that sleep deprivation, that is when all kinds of crazy things can start happening in your mind. And so it's a very fine dividing line then of deciding when to keep pushing and when it's not really safe to, and that you need to stop and sleep. So
well, it
it's
certainly
always
sounds like you know where your boundaries are, but you're also quite happy to push into that that stretch zone.
Yeah, it's a very fine balancing act. If you push too far, you know, it could be dangerous. You know, you could easily crash the bike. Usually you do get signals coming along from the hallucinations.
So Dave, you are renowned for using the quote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I chose to become." This is clearly an inspirational quote which signifies we are a byproduct of the life choices that we make. So what wise words can you share with our students today to help them aim higher to fulfill their potential?
Yes, I really believe that we've all had incidents and things that may have happened in our lives that we can use as an excuse or a reason not to achieve. But if we really want to be successful, we can overcome things that have happened in our lives. And it's, I think it was T.S. Eliot said something like, it's never late to be what you might have been. One of the other really great quotes and people that I've admired is Chrissie Wellington, who won the Ironman in Hawaii, I think it was 3 times. She used to say that you gain strength, courage and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face, and you must do the thing that you cannot do. From that, as an athlete and like her, I'm always looking for the perfect race, the one where you've really got to get everything out of yourself, both mentally and physically, and that the only limits are those that we place on ourselves, and it's possible to overcome those limits to achieve more than we ever thought possible. So much of it comes from practice. I think one of the things that I saw recently was somebody saying to a musician, you must be so lucky to be so naturally talented at playing an instrument. And the musician said, it's practice. I almost get a bit upset sometimes if people say, oh, you're so lucky you've got that natural ability, because it's almost insulting when you feel that you've worked really hard for it and practiced and practiced and practiced, and that is what leads to success in the end.
What has been the best aspect of being involved with these Deca events?
I would say it's the shared experience, really. It's a kind of community, and the fact that you're all in the same kind of pain and suffering together. It's a real shared bond. It's like everybody really, really wants to do well, but almost all the competitors are really like itching for everybody else to do well at the same time. It's the relationships that you develop, and the people who you do the races with, they become your closest friends.
So you're competing against yourself, but you've also got that great camaraderie, I guess.
Yeah, it's a very special thing. I find myself in the races that people comment about me that I always seem to be smiling and very happy during them, and it almost feels like it's as close as you can get to some kind of spiritual feeling. You're almost living in the moment. But once the start gun goes on one of my races, it's like for the next 8, 9, 10 days, nothing else matters. All the other worries that you have in the world suddenly disappear, and the only focus is just on what you're doing in that particular moment.
Do you find that with your training as well? You know, when you're out doing these long training rides or runs or swims, you can just block out those other issues in your life?
Yes, I would say training and exercise are one of the best things for the human mind, and certainly with all the talk about mental health in recent years, most medical experts are now saying how important exercise is for general relief of stress and tension. You know, and I almost feel that with what we're going through currently with social isolation, it's making us all realise as well the importance of relationships and the connections that we have with other people.
Absolutely. And I think often we concentrate on the physical benefits of exercise and we forget about those mental benefits. And I think they're very joined. They're very joined up.
Oh, absolutely, definitely. The physical and the mental goes so much hand in hand, and especially if you're not feeling in the greatest of mood very often, and actually getting through the front door or down to the swimming pool or down to the lake, it can feel like the last thing on earth that you feel like doing. But if you somehow find that oomph to just get yourself there and actually do that exercise, you just absolutely know that once you've done that exercise, you'll feel better than before you did it. It just happens every single time. The more often that you've had that experience, the more often then you know that when you are feeling down and low, when the temptation is to go and hide in your bed and pull the duvet over the top of your head, that is not the best way to do things. And if you can just somehow find it within yourself to get out the front door and go and exercise, it's like a guarantee you will feel better once you've done it.
So alongside your training, you run a personal training business. Obviously, the two seem to dovetail very well. How did that come about? Did you need to do some extra qualifications, or were those qualifications carried over from your teaching days?
Yeah, I did 20 years as a school teacher, and then for various reasons, I had the chance to change career. So it was a big risk at the time. It's maybe part of what has made me successful in the sport that I do, that I'm willing to take those risks and to change and to accept that change can be good. So I got the chance to do a personal training course. So obviously with no guarantee of work at the end of it. So it was a whole new world from having a very steady, guaranteed job of being a school teacher to changing career completely at the age of 40 something, just into my 40s, and to realise that any income that came my way was absolutely dependent upon people being happy with the service that I provided for them.
It sounds a fantastic way to combine your loves, really, of teaching and sport.
Yeah, it's very feels a very privileged and lucky position, really, that my work, what I actually call work now, it doesn't really feel like work. It's just doing what I would do as a hobby anyway, and I'm just very lucky that I can earn a living from it at the same time.
Looking back, do you feel that you wish you'd started triathlons and Decas at an earlier age so you could achieve more? Or I guess it's quite difficult to say to a world record holder, but you talked about that sort of late connection with sport.
Yeah, well, we can never regret the past, can we? I think the best thing to do is always to look forward. I think when I got onto the Great Britain elite team, and I was 37 at the time, it was then I was at the stage where I could potentially have taken the risk to turn professional and see how far I might have progressed at the top level in triathlon at Ironman distance. But at the time, you know, I had a family and a full-time job, so it was at the time then it was too much of a risk to make the jump with no guarantees attached to it, especially when you think as a 37-year-old, most people are thinking that their top competitive days are coming to an end then. It's just been really unusual for me that they've continued for another 20 years.
And I guess many of our listeners will just want to know how you cope mentally. Where and how have you built up that mental resilience?
It's a very difficult question. I suppose a lot of it comes from all our life experiences, you know, various things that have happened in childhood that kind of shaped our brains and the way that they work. And again, so much of it it's just a gradual process of a continual belief in exercise and the value of it, and training year in, year out, that has just become my practice and the way I live my life, and just knowing that every other aspect of life seems to go better when you're feeling fit and healthy and strong.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dave. We are very privileged to have a world record holder on the show, and I know that the children will feel inspired to get out there and to try to push themselves further in whatever way they feel is appropriate for their ability and their context, particularly at the moment with the COVID and isolation.
Yes.
Are there any last words that you would like to pass on to our students to wish them well in their sporting endeavours?
And there's always a new challenge, and always regard that as an incentive, that when I do the race this year of the 30 Ironmans in 30 days, the number one thing will be to enjoy preparing for it and to enjoy the race when it's actually happening, but also to have a goal at the back of my mind to achieve the maximum possible, and to know that if everything went perfectly for me, that a world record would still be possible, but to enjoy the race in any case.
They do say prior preparation prevents poor performance. Are you an avid fan of that?
Yes, I think it's another saying that I've got written down here, which I always use. The will to win is important, but the will to prepare is vital. And I think a really ancient quote from Aristotle was, "We are what we repeatedly do." Excellence is not an act, but it's a habit. Even in this period where we are at the moment, where I made the decision not to cycle outside at all, not feeling that it was a fair thing to do currently. So right in front of me now, I've got an exercise bike set up, and I've set the goal in April to do 1,000 miles in my lounge on the bike. So
that's a great inspiration to our listeners, because I'm sure they're wondering how they can even start this journey that you've been on. But if you're doing it in your front lounge, and I'm sure they can as well.
Yes, well, and it's just finding any little lever that pushes you at any time. There's always something. I remember one of my colleagues that I taught with, when they were teaching in quite a difficult school, and he just always used to say, we try and find any lever that we possibly can to connect with other people and to encourage them to make the best of themselves.
So how can the students follow you? What websites and what Facebook pages have you got that we can connect with?
Oh, yes. So I have a website, which is DecaDave.com, it's got an interview on there actually that we did immediately after the 20 Ironmans in 20 days world record.
To DecaDave.com.
Yes.
And how about Facebook? Have you got a personal training Facebook page?
Yes, I have, and that is on Deca PT.
Deca PT. There we go. I'm sure some inspirational training habits and wise words will come through on that one. Well, thanks so much. It's been really lovely to talk to you, Dave, and it'd be lovely to come and support you at some of your events, as and when they happen, and as and when people are allowed to travel.
Well, thank you very much for speaking to me, Nikki, and wish you all the best to the pupils at the school, and hope they found at least a tiny bit of inspiration from what I've said today.
I'm sure they will do. I'm absolutely sure they will do.
Well, next week we move away from performers to professionals as we work on the British Judo Performance Director, Nigel Donoghue. Nigel represented England and won a bronze medal in the 1986 Commonwealth Games in wrestling. Switching sports to judo, Donoghue was better known for his participation in the 1992 and 1996 Summer Olympics and for being crowned European champion in 1995. Now working as the Performance Director for the British Judo team, Nigel provides a great example of how to have a successful career in sport beyond competition. Thanks for listening.